Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, and remember, Context is Everything Media Network founder and CEO John Michael is finishing this book here today. Thank you for joining along. We're on chapter 15, which is the role of spirituality in healing the child within, and we're in the portion of the chapter titled Our Observer Self. We're going to read to the end of this chapter here today, the end of this book. Thank you. Our observer self. As we evolve and grow in our recovery, we discover that there is a part of us perhaps located somewhere in the higher self of our child within that is able to step back and to watch, witness, observe what is happening in our lives. For example, many people have experienced becoming extremely upset and then detaching from their upset and feeling to such an extent that they themselves actually are observing themselves in that upset. Sometimes there is an out-of-body experience so that they are able to see themselves or a representation of themselves having the upset. This ability can be facilitated by practicing guided or eidetic imagery and visualization. I've never heard that word before. eidetic, eidetic imagery or visualization. Closing the eyes, the person visualizes or otherwise imagines the scene or activity about which their concern is. One can then visualize a positive solution to the upset. This can also be done while meditating. Done constructively, this is a healthy practice. Dykman and others call this powerful and freeing part of us the observer or observing self. The Western psychological literature refers to this observing self as the observing ego, but does not explore the special nature of the ego and its implications for understanding of the self. It thus continues to miss the dynamics, meanings, and importance of the observer self, and its theories of the self remain somewhat confused. The observing self is central to our recovery. An illustration is shown in Figure 6. This shows the interrelationships of the self or object self and the observing self. The self is concerned with thinking, feeling, acting, desiring, and other survival-oriented activities. This older and less useful concept of the self includes parts of both false self and the true self. However, the observer self, a part of who we all really are, is that part of us that is watching both the false self and our true self. We might say that it is even watching us when we watch. It is our consciousness. It is the core experience of our child within. It thus cannot be watched, at least by anything or any being that we know of on this earth. It transcends our five senses, our codependent self, and all other lower, though necessary, parts of us. So I have table 16 on the previous page. I'm going to show you here the screen. And now I'm going to read it. Table 16, defining some clinical therapeutic properties of the self, levels 4 through 7. Love, truth, healing, power, along with human consciousness. This would have been proper in the previous reading, but I'm going to do it anyway now. So, on this first column here, hierarchy of consciousness. You have 7 through 1. Unity, collective consciousness. 6 is compassion. 5 is understanding. 4 is acceptance. 3 is mind and ego. 2 is passion. And 1 is survival. So that's a hierarchy of needs, Maslow, and all that. Next, you have how it's iterated in love, how it's iterated in truth, healing, and power. So, hierarchy of consciousness. Let's start from one. So let's start from the bottom. Survival is the hierarchy of consciousness, level one. Its representation in love is just neediness, right? A neediness, not a great representation of love, but it is a representation of love at a low level. Survival, so level one, in truth, we're just thinking scientifically. Very important. Foundational, really. Survival need for healing, just physical healing. Survival need for power is physical strength. Second level, passion. Survival need for love is chemistry, so some connection there. Survival need for passion need for truth is sensations. Passion need for healing is nurturance. Passion need for power is manipulation. Third level is the mind and the ego. Mind and ego love, worship, or possess. Mind and ego, truth, experience, and beliefs. Mind and ego, healing, prevention, education, and psychologic. Mind and ego, representation of power, assertion, persuasion. Next level is acceptance and heart. That level, acceptance and heart level of love, is forgiveness. Acceptance and heart level for truth is forgiveness. Acceptance and heart level for healing is forgiveness. And acceptance and heart level for power is forgiveness. Understanding is level 5 of the hierarchy of needs here. Understanding level of love is commitment to growth. Understanding level of truth is creativity. Understanding level of healing is right decision making. An understanding level of power is wisdom. Next level up in the hierarchy of needs is hierarchy of consciousness is compassion. Compassionate love, unconditional empathy and acceptance. Compassionate truth, love and acceptance. Compassionate healing, love and acceptance. Compassionate power, love and acceptance. And the top level of the hierarchy of consciousness, unity consciousness. Love, peaceful being, truth, peaceful being, healing, peaceful being, power, peaceful being. And now while I'm not reading, I'm going to show you the figure 6 here, which was referenced just earlier. And I'll take a look at it myself. Observing self, awareness, consciousness, aspects of the self that are being observed. Thinking, planning, solving, worrying, emotion, feeling, effect, action, behavior, functioning, desire, wish, fantasy. Relationships of the observing self and the self is the title of that, by Dykman. Adult children may confuse their observing self with the kind of defense that they may have used to avoid their real self and all of its feelings. One might call this defense a false observer self. Since its awareness is clouded, it is unfocused as it spaces or numbs out. It denies and distorts our child within and is often judgmental. By contrast, our true observer self has a clear awareness, observes more accurately, and tends to be accepting. The following outlines these differences. Some differences between the true observer self and the false observer self. The true and the false. You have... I'm going to show you here. So I'm reading this here. Awareness and focus. The true representation of awareness and focus is clear and observational. The false representation of awareness and focus is clouded, spaced out, or numbed out. True feeling and attitude observes accurately and is accepting. false feeling and attitude, is judgmental, and denies. Expanding our consciousness, we can soon become aware of our part in the larger drama, the cosmic drama. By watching our own personal dance or melodrama, we can begin to learn that our observer self is the part of us that which, when we realize we are really carrying on, we can step back and observe the carrying on through the power of our imagination. By doing so, we often bring into play the powerful defense of humor. Example, laughing at ourselves or talking or taking it all so seriously. Deichmann said, "The observing self is not part of the object world formed by our thoughts and sensory perceptions, because literally it has no limits. Everything else does. Thus, every day consciousness contains a transcendent element that we seldom notice, because that element is the very ground of our experience. The word transcendent is justified because if subject consciousness, the observing self, cannot itself be observed, but remains forever apart from the contents of the consciousness, it is likely to be a different order from everything else. Its fundamentally different nature becomes evident when we realize that the observing self is featureless. It cannot be affected by the world any more than a mirror can be affected by the images it reflects. As our observer self becomes more prominent, our lower or object self tends to recede. Primary identification with our lower self tends to be associated with suffering and illness. However, building a strong and flexible ego or object self, which is part of the healing of the child within, is usually required before we can transition into our observer self for any lasting duration. Realizing serenity. New heading. As we become more familiar with being our observer self and with the healing power of spirituality, we can begin to construct a possible path to realizing serenity, inner peace, and happiness. I have condensed the following description from Alcoholism and Spirituality, where each is discussed in more detail. Some possible paths to serenity. Number 1, we are ignorant of our journey. We are limited humility. We can study universal laws, approximate them, surrendered to our lack of ultimate knowledge. Given these limitations, sages over the centuries describe something like the following. 2, higher power is in each of us, and we are in a higher power. 3, we can view our reality as a hierarchy of levels of awareness, consciousness, or being. Number 4, we are going home. We are home already and always. Home on this earth is being all levels of our awareness or consciousness in our own unique fashion. There will be conflict going home. Number 5, melodrama, cosmic drama. This conflict or creative tension is useful to us in some way, probably as a way home. Number 6, we have a choice. We can use our bodies, egos, minds, our relationships on this earth to reinforce our separation and our suffering, or we can use them as a vehicle for our soul, spirit, or higher self to return home and to celebrate that return. Higher power, home, is love. Love is perhaps the most useful way we know the higher power. We can remove the blocks to realizing our higher power by experiencing, including living in the now, remembering, forgiving, surrendering. These 5 realizations can be viewed as being ultimately the same. Regular spiritual practices help us with these realizations. Separation, number 9. Suffering and evil are suffering and evil are the absence of realizing love, and they are therefore ultimately illusions. They are also manifestations of our searching for love, wholeness, and home. The evil and darkness is thus ultimately in the service of the light. Number 10. We create our own story by thoughts and actions. What we think and feel in our mind and heart, we will produce in our experience and our life. What we give, we get. As within, so without. So without. Number 11. Life is a process, force to flow that lives. Life is a process, force or flow that lives us. We do not live it, that lives us. Okay. Life is a process, force or flow that lives us. We do not live it. When we surrender to it, i.e., flow with the process and take responsibility for our participation in it, we become co-creators. We can then become free of our suffering that comes with our attachment to resisting flowing with our life. And 12. Inner peace or serenity is knowing, practicing, and being all of the above. We ultimately discover that we are already and always in serenity and home. Some of these principles are illustrated in the following case history of James, a 42-year-old man who grew up in an alcoholic family. His father being the actively drinking alcoholic, and his mother usually assuming the role of the placating codependent. While she showed no manifestations of being an alcoholic, he showed no manifestations of being an alcoholic himself, James, throughout his adult life, James was progressively aware of his inordinate confusion and suffering. He eventually attended Al-Anon and later ACOA, Adult Child of Alcoholics, self-help group meetings for a total of about 6 years with some improvement. He describes the importance of meaning and the spiritual part of his recovery as follows. I went to a lot of Al-Anon and ACOA self-help meetings over these years, probably 1 or 2 a week. I really wanted to get well, but I didn't seem to be doing it, although something seemed to keep me motivated to keep attending. I had always thought it was important for me to be strong, which I equated with being independent. This meant to me not to talk much. I believed I could recover on my own without anyone's help. I equated weakness with trusting, surrender, or being dependent, all of which I saw as being kind of sickness. I viewed people with these characteristics as being sick, and of course I felt I was healthier or somehow better than they were. Looking back, I see all of this is a probably necessary defense that allows me to keep attending the meetings without being too overwhelmed by my hidden feelings and the changes I needed to make to recover. During that time, I met a woman at the meetings who was really arrogant and unhappy. She was so obnoxious to me that I tried avoiding being around the meetings she attended. I thought there was no hope for her and that I certainly was better than she was. Then I saw her change. She started to lose her arrogant attitude. I became friendlier to me and to others. She seemed happy. Well, I hated to admit it, since it was coming from her, who I had never admired. I felt envious of her positive change. I wanted some of that. But she was also now talking about her higher power. And I have always had trouble knowing what that was, even though I had a fairly active religious upbringing. So I began considering what had happened to her and how I might get some of that peace or happiness. It began to occupy a lot of my thoughts and feelings. I'd been through 40 years of unhappiness and confusion. I began to read some spiritual literature. I began to pray. Well, I had tried to pray since I was a child. There was something different about my praying this time. Perhaps I was more sincere and humble. Then some months later, I experienced a kind of transformation that came on me over about a 2-week period. My own attitude changed, and I let go of my resentment of my father and of others. Of course, I had done a lot of work in the past on my anger and other feelings as well as other issues of mine. I began to really believe in a higher power, something I'd never been able to do. I had first reframed health and happiness, and then reframed happiness as being associated with needing others to surrender and surrendering to them and to be spiritual program. Doing so made all the difference. I'm going to read the last part in English. I had first reframed health as happiness, and then reframed happiness as being associated with needing others and surrendering to them and to spiritual program. Doing so has made all the difference. James's story illustrates several of the principles of the ways realizing serenity. First, he experienced conflicts and struggles. Which is number 5. He used the struggle in his uncomfortable relationship with the woman he resented as a vehicle for his spiritual evolution and growth, which is number 6 in that list that I read about 5 minutes ago, maybe 6. He was aware of his conflict and pain and began a regular spiritual practice, prayer, which is number 8. He eventually asked for what he wanted, this time with sincerity and humility, number 10. And he surrendered to the process of the process of his life, number 11. Ultimately, he found that he was seeking, and he was inside of himself and nowhere else, number 12. The traditional or conventional views of attaining serenity, inner peace, or happiness usually use one or both of the either seeking pleasure or avoiding pain. In the seeking approach, the ways of seeking happiness may span a range from hedonistic seeking to focusing on others. which can be a result of in codependence, which can result in codependence, to being good and wanting to claim our peace later as a reward in heaven. In avoiding pain approach, we may try to ignore pain, detach from it, or stay away from any situation that might bring on conflict for us. We may ask, has either seeking or avoiding ever brought us lasting peace, happiness, or serenity? While I've asked this of others and myself, the answer is usually no. In response, one of the choices is to feel hurt and resentful about our inability to be happy and to project our pain onto others. Or a second alternative, we might begin to observe the whole process and begin to observe the self-contraction of our codependent self. When we are unhappy, as we do so, we can begin to see that happiness is not something that we attain. Rather, happiness, peace, or serenity is our natural state. Beneath all what we add to our feelings and experiences, beneath our self-contraction lies serenity itself. To realize serenity, there is nothing that we can do, or even that we... To realize serenity, there is nothing that we need to do, or that we can do. If we make all A's on our report card, that won't do it. Neither will owning 3 Rolls Royces, nor will having $1 million or marrying Mr. or Mrs. Right. There's no way that we can earn or achieve happiness, and neither is there any way that we can deserve it. Rather, it is ours inherently, already, and always. That's Da Free John, who said that. Dafrejohn. For adult children of trauma, accepting this idea that we are inherently happy may be difficult. If it is so, I think I can understand. As we heal our child within, this realization that we are already and always happy becomes easier and easier. I have found that doing a daily spiritual practice, such as meditation or prayer, and reading spiritual literature has been helpful in realizing my own serenity. Some readers may be skeptical about this concept of spirituality. Some may be confused. Others may not believe any of it, and may even feel like this author sure has lost it now. By contrast, others may find some solace in reading it. And still, others may identify a lot of useful material here. Whatever your reaction, I invite you to follow your reactions and instincts. Reflect upon it, talk about it whenever you may sense that it is appropriate. Use what you can and leave the rest. Spirituality has worked for me, and I have seen it work for hundreds of others in healing their child within. That's it. That's the book. Healing the Child Within. And that's the guy. God bless. Goodbye.